And we're going to start with your full name and when and where you were born.
Judy Norsigian. I legally Judith, but I don't go by that. And I was born in Brighton, Massachusetts at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts, right next to Boston.
And when was that?
Well, I was born in 1948, so I'm 73 almost. And I lived in Watertown pretty much my whole my whole career in sort of elementary, high school, even for part of my college years. I lived a few miles away in Harvard Square, but my home was still on Charles River Road in Watertown.
Okay. And what was your childhood like briefly?
Well, of course, there was no consciousness at all about the women's movement. Anything that had been done earlier in the 20th century. My mother, however, was a woman who felt cheated out of what she wanted. She wanted to go to medical school. She grew up in an Armenian family. The father didn't even want the females to speak. He was like, you know, women should be seen and not heard. So she didn't get to go to medical school, though she was valedictorian of her class and she played the violin and she was really smart. She ended up becoming a lab technician. She ended up drawing bloods. Phlebotomist or whatever you want to call it. And she worked at Mass General Hospital for a few years before she took a train out to the West Coast and met my dad. Let me just say that I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts. My father had escaped the Armenian genocide at the age of 5, spent some time in Marseille, came to Boston English High School when he was about 15, knew Armenian and French and learned English pretty quickly and was a math wizard. So even though he got a scholarship to go to MIT, he had to work during the day and do night classes at Northeastern because his dad died and he had to support the family. He and my mother raised a family of 5 kids in Watertown, Massachusetts. I was number 2. And I enjoyed a pretty happy childhood. I played the cello, I played sports, I had a great neighborhood life. My father was unusual in that at the age of 12, I got a copy of Marriage and Morals by Bertrand Russell. And I don't know if you read that book, but in it, pretty much in the first few chapters, it says that people shouldn't get married till they live together first and know they're well suited. Things like that were a little mind-blowing for me as a 12-year-old. And then he said things like, you need to go to college and have a career because you never know when you need to support yourself. It was not about, you know, find a man and, you know, the man will support you, although he assumed I would get married and have children.
Right.
And we shared a love of mathematics. He didn't get to go to MIT, which is something that he had hoped to do. He got in, but then he had to go to work during the day to support his family. But he and I were very close. And it's because of him that I think I developed a really strong sense of self. My mother, though she didn't get to go to medical school, she was in the League of Women Voters. I remember she was working on a couple of presidential campaigns and had me tag along with her. I got a sense of her as civically minded, and that she ranged from my music lessons and went out skating with the kids on the Charles River. She was a pretty neat mom. But I didn't have any idea about racism until I was in 8th grade. And one of the very few Black girls moved into Watertown at that point. I think there were maybe 4 Black families at that point. And I was a member of Rainbow Girls, part of the Masonic Order. And my father had just gotten in. They had excluded a friend at BF Goodrich where he worked and who got him in. And we said, oh, Thelma, you should join Rainbow Girls. We had no idea that Blacks were not allowed in Rainbow Girls. So when we filled out the application with her and she was told she couldn't join, a number of us were absolutely horrified. We wrote a letter. We told the idiot adults who said the rules were made in the South. Sorry, we don't make the rules up here. We said, that's a lousy excuse. And we up and quit. But not all of the young girls quit. And that's when I saw the fault lines in relationships with some of my best friends.
Mm.
There was one in particular who didn't quit Rainbow Girls, and that was the beginning of a deep divide between us. And my father was totally supportive. In fact, at one point I was like, Dad, how come you're in the Masonic order, right? Uh, anyway, that changed. He left. But that was my introduction to the kind of exclusionary practices that were widespread in the United States, but I hadn't seen it yet because Blacks were just moving into the Watertown area. My sister, 2 years younger, started to date a young teenage Black kid from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I forget how they met. And my aunt, who lived upstairs, was horrified, and she would be yelling at my father. How could he allow this? And of course, there's a lot of racism in the Armenian community, especially at that point. And my father would just tell her to mind her own business and go back upstairs. You know, he's like totally fine with this relationship. So we had a family where we weren't dealing with the racism in the family, but we could see, oh, we live in a world where this is a big problem. And so my sister was being challenged by an aunt, someone we both loved. I could see that this woman was racist in other ways. There were other examples. It was a young Kenyan man who was at Sergeant camp. It was one of the camps that Boston University ran, and there were people from other countries joining. And I just happened to make friends with him while I was in Youth Symphony that summer. And so he came and visited us one year, and my father was gracious and welcomed him. And of course, my aunt upstairs had a sissy fit. So I saw these examples over and over again. Mm-hmm. My experience in college was the first time where I was thinking hard about the civil rights movement, about the peace movement, and the anti-Vietnam era. There was the big Harvard strike, that horrible experience in Harvard Yard. I didn't get caught in the sort of mayhem because of my conscience about babysitting for this couple back in a house where off-campus house where I lived. And of course, when I got back there to see if they needed me to babysit, they were laughing because everything was blowing up and nobody was on campus. And by the time I went back to Harvard Yard, I was locked out. And so I never was part of that very traumatic experience in the Yard and in University Hall. But I have to say that even through all of this, I didn't know about feminism, though feminism was happening. And this tells you something about how insular we can be, even in our concerns about social justice and getting out there and being active and, fighting an unjust war and, the civil rights movement and all of that. I was clueless. And I began to get an inkling about gender roles and stereotyping much more when I was living communally after I graduated from college in upstate New York. And it was through those relationships and our meeting with folks on college campuses as an intentional community that I began to understand the beginnings of that. Plus, we were breaking down gender roles in our commune where women were, repairing cars, we were operating the farming equipment, men were doing childcare and baking bread. We were doing conscious breaking down of sexual stereotypes, but I still didn't know about the huge women's movement. And this was 1971. Okay. 71. And I moved back to Boston in June or July of 71 and living communally again. And one of the men in the commune was in a men's group with Jane Pincus's husband, Ed Pincus, a very well-known filmmaker who has since passed away. And it was through that connection I found out about this group of women. And I joined up, went to a meeting. I fit right in. I loved these women from the start. And I had been doing organic farming and gardening from our experience in that commune. And so I wanted to work on the next edition, newsprint edition at that point of Our Bodies, Ourselves, to bring in the subject of nutrition. And I think we called it The Food We Eat or something like that. And that was my beginnings with the collective. It was not through reproductive health and reproductive justice issues. It was through my concern about food and nutrition and physical well-being, and also being strong in our bodies. So I was very interested in self-defense and interested in addressing the violence against women problems that were endemic. And that was a natural it was really serendipity that I met the group, that I fit right in. I was the youngest person at that point, and I started going to meetings in September of 1971. The book had already come out as a newsprint edition. And by the turn of the year, early 72, in January, I think we made the decision to go with Simon & Schuster. We incorporated legally. We signed a contract, I think in March of 72. And the book came out in March of 73 with Simon & Schuster. So that's my early connection. And it was very, very, very instantaneous. I think that I grabbed onto all these other issues: birth control, abortion, childbirth. And I never had an abortion. I didn't have trouble with birth control because there was a kindly gentleman in Harvard Square, and very well-known gynecologist, who gave young women contraceptives illegally. He happened to have a lot of daughters. He thought the laws were stupid. And so when I needed a diaphragm, somebody said, oh, just go down to Harvard Square and see Dr. Funkhauser, a wonderful older man. And so I didn't know that these things were huge issues, because I was sent to the resources that I needed, and nobody said it's even illegal. I don't think I knew it was illegal. So, or just become legal just recently.
For non-married women.
Yeah, for non-married. Yeah, I think it was
1970,
late 60s, 70, I think it happened here. And
yeah, 72 is the case that extended availability to.
right. So it was illegal.
weren't married.
But I just blanked out on his name, the huge birth control advocate here, the guy who went to jail. And he had a big event at Boston University. He got into trouble with the law. At our 40th anniversary celebration, Leonard Glantz, who's then a professor, since retired, told the story. This is one of those moments that drive me nuts.
Well,
somebody
let's
I
hear
know
it.
well. I met him, and now I can't think of his name.
Oh, okay.
But he's in books. He wrote a book. We all know him.
Okay, we'll think of him, or we'll add it in a footnote in your transcript. So, I was, of course, one of those people who got the book as soon as it came out. I was in DC area, and I was always so attracted to the cover picture of the young women carrying signs. Is there any story about that? I mean, it was just, oh, she has it right handy.
Yeah, this is the December 1970 edition.
Oh,
it wasn't even called Our Bodies Ourselves. It was called Women in Their Bodies. And then in March of 71, the title Our Bodies Ourselves was adapted.
Right.
And
So,
notice that price, 30 cents.
oh, I love it. So it was, I didn't realize that it was newsprint. I think I must have gotten the first Simon and Schuster edition.
That's right. That one was 1973. It had red letters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it was just, it was just revelatory, all the different chapters. And of course, I was in a consciousness raising group myself at that time, and gave us lots of food for thought.
And one of the most fascinating things to watch what's happened over the last 50 plus years is that back then there was nothing in lay language that you could put your hands on as a woman of any age, really. And we were all in the dark about so many things regarding our bodies. So there was this incredible dearth. So it was such an awakening for all of us to read about these things, to share our experiences, to write them down. The whole process was amazing. You flash forward 50 years, the internet is flooded with stuff about all of these topics, pretty much. Much of it is inaccurate, distorted, full of lies in cases, if it has to do with reproduction and abortion, lots of stuff that's simply falsehoods out there. So you have to sift through plethora of websites and information of all sorts to get at what we call the good stuff. So there is too much information most of it not very good. And those who are looking for high quality information, where the evidence is good, where, you know, the language is clear, you have to really hunt and
Yeah.
peck a whole lot. And that's one of the reasons why we're so excited that this project, Our Bodies, Ourselves Today, has been launched at Suffolk University, because it will be basically the digital version of not just the concrete factual information grounded in women's experiences, but it'll also be evidence-based advocacy work, all online, all
Oh,
involving advocates and activists, not just from this country, but from around the globe. So we're very excited that Our Bodies, Ourselves Today has launched at Suffolk, that it will have this sort of digital platform for a lot of this work to continue. And
product.
it's still a huge problem that most of what we call sexuality education is under local control. So at the state level, you can sometimes mandate you do something in this arena, but you can't dictate what it is.
Right.
And so as a result, we saw abstinence only based curricula, which were purveying all kinds of misinformation. That did so much damage. I remember speaking to a professor at a medical school in Chicago who said, we have medical students who come in with such ignorance about things like condoms that they will get up in class and say condoms will spread STI, sexually transmissible infections. They'll spread AIDS. And he'll look at them and say, where did you get that? Well, they got it in high school in their abstinence only sex ed class. And they went through 4 years of college not having that straightened out. So they come to medical school with a misunderstanding of what condoms are, what they can do, an idea that they promote disease. This is ridiculous, right?
Yeah, I'm
That
not shocked. I got to tell you.
that damage that we have seen over years and years of abstinence only sex ed is still continuing. And that's why we need so many of these other projects. And I know you know about SICUS, the Sex Information and Education Council of the US,
Yes.
started by a wonderful visionary woman, OBGYN, many decades ago. SICUS is still trying to support people at the local level, struggling to get fact-based, really humane sexuality education out there for young people. It is an enormous struggle.
Tell me, what was your role at Our Bodies, Ourselves over the years? Did it change?
Well, in the beginning, we were largely a group of volunteers. We were a collective that initially tried to make all our decisions by consensus. It wasn't always possible, but we did that
the
for
times, yes.
a long time. And then eventually we had to create a formal board of directors where, even though some of us were paid for the work we did and some people worked, some people didn't, we eventually morphed into more of a staff-driven model over the years, where we had a board of directors that had some founders on it who are in the original collective, but also some community-based board members. And in large part, this was urged by some of our major funders, like the Ford Foundation, because they didn't want the fox guarding the chicken coop. You know, they really didn't want to have a worker-controlled collective in charge of everything. You're being paid, you're doing the work. You know, they wanted to have a more conventionally organized community board of directors. And so we moved to that model. And there were always a couple of original founders on the board, but never more than a couple after a while. And it was largely a community group. And over the years, of course, we've introduced board members from other parts of the world. And as we've been able to meet online, and, you know, it's less of an issue that you can't come to a board meeting in person. Well, we have been doing all of our board meetings by Zoom for a while, like everybody else. And it's meant that it's been much easier, particularly when some of our board members who are based in other countries might have been here but had to go back to their country, they could participate more easily. So I was one of the people who worked a little bit. I was not one of the first coordinators. Esther Rome took on that major role, coordinating with Simon and Schuster during the first edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves that came out in 1973. I was at that point in time working with another young man running a teen center in Cambridge. It was part of the LEAA, Law Enforcement Assistance Administration funds that came out to prevent juvenile delinquency. I don't know if you remember that back in the 70s, but we got some of that funding. We used it to, create teen centers. And I was working a lot with teenagers in the Cambridge area. And I was introducing sexuality education, partly because I was also involved with Our Bodies, Ourselves, and did some creative things in that role. And after, I don't know, a year or two, I moved on to doing other things. I learned about auto mechanics when I had lived communally. And so I taught auto mechanics for women at the local YWCA in Cambridge. Nowadays with computers, you can't do that, but then we could. And then I got gradually more involved as a paid part-time staff member. We were paying ourselves initially $4 an hour. It was not very much money, but we decided that, we and others should be paid for the work we do. And we felt that volunteerism was a problem. Of course, over the years, we've done a mix of paying and taking advantage of volunteer help when somebody wanted to help, didn't need the money, and said, use it for something else, use it to support a group of low-income women doing work in whatever fashion. So we have been flexible about this issue of payment for work over the years. I think, I can't remember exactly when, but it was during maybe the latter part of the 70s that I began to work more and more for Our Bodies, Ourselves, and ultimately became a full-time staff member. We had various models of management over the years. We had administrative directors. I was mainly involved in programmatic issues. Then we had a few seismic moments where we changed radically, and that's all on a timeline at our website. And in 2001, I became the first executive director of the organization. And we were somewhat downsized at that point, and we were operating out of free space that Boston University School of Public Health gave us, which was a great opportunity for us to get back on our feet. And we've always had a close relationship with Boston University School of Public Health. George Ennis, his work around the Patient's Bill of Rights, his work around genetics. He was a mentor and a scholar whom we valued so much. The same with Leonard Glantz, another close colleague, and others who were on faculty, Joanna Rory, Lisa Payne. I could go on, the list is quite long. People who supported us, collaborated with us, and we still maintain a close connection. And in fact, one of our big 50th anniversary Zoom events is going to be hosted by Boston University School of Public Health tomorrow on April 21st. So we continued with that model. We were very small staff on through until I stepped down late 2014, the end of the year, because I became obsessed with climate change and felt that I needed to, pass on the torch anyway and have time for volunteer work on the climate crisis. And at that point, there was a fundraising effort. It was somewhat successful. We were able to hire this wonderful new executive director. Her name is Julie Childers, who worked with the organization for a couple of years. It was not able to get itself solidly ensconced with sufficient funds coming in. And there was a major meeting of staff, founders, and the board to talk about what next. And then we decided, basically, I think in 2016, I'm not exactly sure of the date, that we would morph into a volunteer-driven model. And in order for that to work, I came on as a volunteer sort of chair of the board, but taking on executive functions. But we would transition to a largely volunteer-driven nonprofit with no staff. And as you know, Judy, without staff, it simplifies the process of running an organization. Yeah. And we had a lot of volunteers to help with the programmatic end of things. And we had a few grants that enabled us to hire some consultants. And so we have been, for the last 2.5 years, functioning this way. I am now looking to pass on within the next year or two the board chair role, and I'm happy to maintain my role in whatever ways would be useful, with fundraising a little here and there and helping with networking with some of our colleagues. But the work is continuing largely through our close colleagues who are the heavy lifters. They're the ones who are creating an agenda for advancing reproductive justice or some of the issues we've worked on. We're providing a supportive role. We're maybe writing a letter. We're maybe weighing in as asked to, signing on to amicus briefs. We're doing what we can, but we're not the lead organization on any one of these issues anymore. Even something that we created, surrogacy360.org, which is largely around the health and human rights of gestational mothers, around the health risks that young women take when they provide eggs, either freezing them for themselves or providing them for gestational purposes for others or for research purposes. Largely, young women have no idea that we have no long-term safety data. They are very limited in what they know about the safety profile of these procedures and the drugs used. So we have been supporting these kinds of efforts. Sometimes we've been able to support financially, and we are hoping to do so more in the coming years. But at the moment, we have a small budget. We have no staff. We have a few really important consultants, particularly around running our website and with some of our finances. And that's the sort of holding pattern I see at the moment. It's enabled us to be a partner for some of the women's groups in other countries who've come to us over the last few years and said, we want to do another translation adaptation of the book. And this one came out just last year, Notre Corps Nous Mène, women in France who, mostly younger women, got the blessing of a few of the older women who did the first French edition back in the 1970s. They produced a totally revised, revamped, reworked edition of the book. And women in Morocco are working on something similar. Women in Canada have produced another French language, Our Bodies, Ourselves, it's called something else, out of Montreal, and it's largely for women in the Quebec area. The women in Brazil are producing a very large project at the moment. They've done the book in thirds. They're on the third part of the project to produce a translation adaptation in Portuguese for Portuguese-speaking women everywhere. They will have some of this book online, probably not the whole book, because they're going with a commercial publisher to produce a print edition as well. That remains to be seen. We've been able to provide some financial support through a donor for that project, and we hope to do this for more projects. One of our board members, Diana Namumbeja, was the woman who did the Lugandan edition for women in Uganda a few years back, and she wants to translate and adapt more sections of the book with some of her peers, and that's possibly something we can get support for in the future. There are other women struggling to finish their long-standing projects, like women in Turkey. A group called Mavis Kalam, they've not been able to finish their project because of the enormous obstacles that feminists have been confronting in Turkey. And I don't need to tell you more about that, you know.
Right. So, I did want to go back to one thing. You'd said, like, over time you had dramatic changes. And I wanted to get a little into sort of the substance of the book. So, obviously your first edition was like, whoa, very basic chapters on how your body works, etc., things you should know. But you did change over the years. And one thing I'm thinking of is when a book came out for older women. So that kind of, and she has one handy. Oh,
well, you know what? It's not within reach. It's somewhere else.
Okay, that's okay. But
it's called
what was, if you can talk about the evolution of the thinking of what the chapters should be or the focus should be.
Well, in Our Bodies, Ourselves itself, we began to add topics with every edition. We didn't have menopause in that first newsprint edition. We had a chapter on rape, but we expanded it to be called violence against women. So there was sexual harassment in the workplace, there could be sexual assault, there could be domestic violence, it could be rape in all forms. It was, I mean, the topic of violence against women is so broad. And initially, we just looked at rape, and that was what the chapter was called. We didn't have a chapter on women in the environment. Over the years, we started to talk much more about the environment, particularly toxics in the environment that had deleterious effects on reproductive health, not just women's reproductive health, but male reproductive health as well. We drew in some fascinating examples, and we continued to have a focus on the environment, pretty much all of the editions. As we started to add more and more substance, particularly to the reproductive health issues, we recognized that there was good material out there on things like women and diabetes and women and heart disease. So we started to take that out of some of the editions produced in the 80s and 90s. And we, in the 2004 and the 2011 editions, we decided to focus on reproductive health and justice across the lifespan. That would include the perimenopause, but it didn't include much older women past the whole reproductive health span. So let me go back. When we were first, dealing with Simon & Schuster, we put out the 1973, the 1976 edition with the green letters on the cover. During that period, some people in the group and elsewhere were saying, you need a book like this for parents. Yes, we need to demystify our body, but what about parenting? We need a sea change here. And it dealt with everything from the need for childcare, shared child rearing, men and women sharing the tasks of raising children together. And that's where the book Ourselves and Our Children came along. And that was produced with Random House, and I think 1977 or 8, I forget the exact year. Ruth and a couple of colleagues produced a book for teenagers. Then Paula Duress and another close colleague, Diana Laskin-Siegel, produced Ourselves Growing Older, which came out in the 80s. And then I think again in maybe 1990, they had 2 different editions of Ourselves Growing Older. And that's a book that I think could be redone by a group of women, because we have so many older women and they need resources like this. Right. But those were specific books, topics geared to a particular group: teenagers, parents, older women. Then we did 2 single topic books, As Our Bodies Ourselves, as the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. One of them was Our Bodies Ourselves Menopause, and one of them was Our Bodies Ourselves Pregnancy and Birth. They came out in 2000, I think 6 and 2008. I think they were maybe a couple of years apart. First, the one on menopause. Those 2 editions are still sold. They're somewhat out of date, but they still have useful information, and particularly some of the self-help techniques in the menopause book. It doesn't have all the latest information from the Women's Health Initiative. It actually predicted what we would learn and had a cautionary tone about using estrogen during menopause. So that was pretty good, that we had enough of a cautionary tone that we would warn women. We've since produced a lot of good information at our website. But one of the things I will mention is that there are projects sometimes inspired by Our Bodies Ourselves and what we've done. One of them is called womenlivingbetter.org. And 2 women started it. Right now, Nina Kozlov runs the whole website. She's working closely with some of our colleagues and has produced some of the most cutting edge information about the perimenopause. And we are so proud of what Nina has done with womenlivingbetter.org, that we try to promote anything new that she does. She's doing research with women. She's promoting the research that has been done by a small group of women researchers, some of them endocrinologists. They're not necessarily OBGYNs, but they're trying to reach OBGYNs because gynecologists are still largely mistreating women who are during the perimenopause, particularly the early perimenopause, coming in with symptomatic problems, and they're not understanding well how to cope with these problems and how to help women cope with these problems. So when a website or a project like this emerges, we are so happy that someone is in that space doing the work that we're no longer doing in a very day-to-day fashion.
That's wonderful. Well, I've come to the end of my questions. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yes, I think that one of the things that has excited me a great deal in the last year or two has been the number of women who are reproductive justice activists who have woven in all the themes that surround our bodies, what we need to know, menstruation, giving birth, dealing with birth control, abortion. They've woven that into our growing consciousness about the legacy of slavery, the need for reparations, the need to find creative ways to support the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter has produced a sea change in consciousness among so many. Those of us who are working to fight voter disenfranchisement, to fight off this awful voter suppression that's happening across the country right now. You can be a nonprofit in any space, women's health, working with teens, teaching kids how to repair bicycles. It doesn't matter what you're doing. And you can also teach civic engagement, and you can really underscore the importance of voting rights, making sure people can register to vote, making sure that people are inspired and engaged and want to vote. It isn't just about fighting suppression, it's about promoting engagement. And what I have seen in the last couple of years amongst activists who have been in this space, the women's health, the women's reproductive space, is a lot more interest in fighting voter suppression and getting people fired up about working in their communities, making sure that people can vote, making sure that we fight hard for this kind of civic engagement and fighting, centuries of this legacy of slavery that has still playing an enormous role. Looking at our police departments and the problematic role that many of them have played. How do we think about public safety in a different way? Yes, one of the themes in our book has always been violence against women, and we have been involved in promoting the awareness of police departments, members of law enforcement, and educating them about what's better needed. But maybe we have to step back and think more carefully about, is incarceration of men who are perpetrators always the best thing to pursue, given what happens with our carceral system? Right. So we're asking a lot of questions like this in our spaces, but I'm so excited to see so many younger people who are thinking intersectionally. The work of Barbara Arnwine in the Transformative Justice Coalition, the work of Kimberly Crenshaw under the Black Light, the African American Policy Forum. There are thousands of people aware of this really important work that is bringing our experiences of racial injustice to the forefront and thinking, how can we work together to make this different going forward? And the ways in which we segregate ourselves, that we don't allow ourselves to work together, they're just everywhere and anywhere. And my own consciousness has been raised in the last couple of years about the key role that residential segregation has played, the ways in which our zoning laws have perpetuated this kind of apartheid, residential apartheid, really. And so I am now working hard in this space of trying to have people like me who are coming new to this issue better understand how zoning laws that say only single family houses can be constructed here are racially problematic, that they're at the heart of this residential segregation. And I'm not saying, you throw it open the doors to, 6 and 8 story high-rise apartment buildings. No, we can do something that provides affordable housing in a way that will welcome a more diverse neighborhood, but that does stop some of the zoning enforced segregation that we have seen throughout this country. And there are a few municipalities, there are a few cities that have been doing creative things in this space. What I am struck by is the number of feminists who don't get it. They don't get it. And they may even be involved in, climate change and, environmental justice, but they don't get it about housing segregation, and that we've got to do some really radical thinking to change how we build new structures, how we rehab old structures, how we make our communities more inviting to a broader swath of the American public. And if we don't deal with residential segregation, we're not going to deal with all these other problems. We have to be living together much more inclusively to enable these kinds of understandings that have to happen.
Well,